Welcome to Conversations With, a podcast series exploring the people and practices shaping the impact of private philanthropy to benefit communities across Africa. Conversations With is produced by the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group, working to promote robust, effective, and responsive philanthropy and to build a network of informed, engaged, and connected funders. Visit the africagrantmakers.org website for program notes and to join our mailing list.
Welcome. My name is Niamani Mutima, and welcome to this briefing on the situation in eSwatini, formerly known as Swaziland. In 2018, the Southern African country known as Swaziland changed its name to eSwatini. It's a landlocked country. It borders Mozambique and South Africa, and it's the second smallest country in Africa with a population of 1.3 million and a median age of 21. So in May, citizens' protests and demands for the end to political repression was met by a government crackdown on protests resulting in injuries and death, and it's received little media attention, and internet restrictions have limited communications and reliable information. So we've invited three dynamic and knowledgeable guests to help us to understand what's taking place. I want to welcome Nikiwe, Kaajal, and Deprose. Thank you all for making the time in your schedules to brief us. And so Nikiwe Kaunda of the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa has agreed to moderate. She's well placed to frame the questions for the issues that are taking place. So Nikiwe, with that, let me hand it over to you to introduce your colleagues and to start the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Niamani. I think you're right. What is happening in eSwatini, it's part of an unprecedented response across the region. So we've seen a lot of instability in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique. We've seen threats to the judiciary in Malawi, across the region, really, in Zimbabwe, in DRC. And so what is happening really is not occurring in a vacuum. And to help us understand the context better, I think we're going to call on Deprose. He is the director of Amnesty International East and Southern African Office, as well as Kaajal, who is the director of Africa Programs at the International Commission of Jurists, ICJ. So welcome to you both. Shall we start with you, Deprose? The calls for democracy in eSwatini are not new. They've gained impetus over the last 2 months or so when a young law student was killed, Thabani, and that is what precipitated the protests and calls for democracy. Could you give us a bit more around the context? You know, what are the current calls for political pluralism about? What are the demands that are being made? And just talk us through how we got here.
Thank you very much, Nikiwe, and good afternoon from this side. It's afternoon from other parts. It could be morning, but hello, folks and friends. What I could say is that I think you situate the conversation very well by saying that Southern Africa as a region is a region that has been known for largely peaceful, pragmatic, and stable region. But at the present moment, it is anything but those descriptions. From the crisis in South Africa, where mass looting has taken place and absolute chaos took over the last couple of days, to Mozambique, where 1 million people have been displaced in Cabo Delgado and 800,000 face starvation as a result of the war, to a slow burn crisis such as Zimbabwe that we all know about, and Zambia, which is going into an election next month, but has created an authoritarian state, and to the disturbances in Lesotho. So it's a challenge for regional political leaders to deal with Swaziland in an isolation of perspective, because it comes through when the region is stretched to deal and combat the current crisis. You raise the issue of the 25-year-old Thabani, law student, who was killed allegedly at the hands of the police. And his death, which ordinarily in a place like eSwatini would have gone unnoticed or with impunity, this time round demanded answers from students, from activists who protested, wanting to know what happened to him. So the Thabani murder is essentially a trigger event rather than a root cause. It is almost like the Sarajevo assassination in the First World War discussion. It triggered long-standing grievances against the authorities in Swaziland, which, as we know, is governed by an absolute monarch. And Swaziland is and I call it Swaziland because others call it eSwatini. I think we can use it interchangeably. Swaziland is as the dubious honor of being the absolute monarch on the continent, arising from the fact that in 1973, 5 years into its independence from Britain, in which an elected parliament had put in place side by side a traditional monarchy, King Sobhuza, who at the time was the king of the country, overthrew the constitution of the country and established an absolute monarch, in which he became the constitution. He became the truth, the way, and the life. And essentially said, we will be replacing the political system that was in place with another system of councils called Tikundla. So that is the system of governance that is obtained in Swaziland since 1973. So as a result of that, you do not have political pluralism in which political parties participate as normally as they do elsewhere. You have retention of draconian colonial era laws such as the 1938 Seditious Activities Act, which have been weaponized from time to time to punish dissent and essentially raise the cost of participating in protests because you'll be seen as committing seditious activities. They've also weaponized a recent law, 2008 Suppression of Terrorism Act, even though Eswatini is not under any terrorist attack. These pieces of legislation, including the Public Order Act and a suppressive environment, has caused Swaziland to rule the country with an iron fist against human rights defenders, against political opposition, journalists, teachers, unions. So most of the groups that you would find in many countries participating in activism find it much more difficult in Swaziland. The bigger problem is that unlike Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, Swaziland does not have the benefit of the economic history of being a regional economic metropole that is known. So there's never sustained international engagement on Swaziland, which creates a climate of impunity for authorities because many people are reticent to comment on a country they know very little about. And this has tended to cloud and shield Swaziland from international censure, media scrutiny, and civil society critique across the region. But this time around, all these things have come to a fore, and Swaziland is in the news in a manner they've never seen before. As a result of this, for the past few weeks, the protests that we saw resulted in Swaziland essentially launching a major human rights offensive on its own country. They launched a proper attack in which live ammunition was used, arrests were done, torture was committed, and persecution of families and groups of people that were targeted was done. So we are now in a context where we are discussing what is to be done. And within Swaziland itself, groups have come together to make particular demands. And they've made 5 demands. One of the demands that they've made is that Swaziland must return to political pluralism. It cannot continue to live in an island in Southern Africa. So an inclusive political dialogue has been called for. The total unbanning of political parties have been called for. A transitional authority has been called for. A new democratic constitution. And finally, multi-party democratic dispensation, by which people mean a competitive political process in which the monarchy is not absolute. Those are the 5 demands that have come through, and I will let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that comprehensive contextual framing. I'll come to you, Kaajal. So 1973, King Sobhuza, he bans multi-party democracy. He expunges the Bill of Rights. He assumes all executive, judicial, and legislative authority. And we know that now there's a system called Tikundla, a system of governance. Could you just talk us through that to help us understand the actual spaces, civic spaces that Swazi citizens have for engaging with the state?
Thank you, Nikiwe. Deprose has given us a comprehensive overview of the current situation as it stands. And from the way that things look at the moment, it appears that King Mswati's days are numbered. His state has an effective capacity for violence and an equally effective intelligence network. But the murderous repression of the rebellion, which began after the killing of Thabani and Komoyo, appears to have turned society against the king. To talk about the constitutional system system, and in particular the system of Tinkundla. According to the Swaziland Constitution, the system of government is democratic and participatory based on this Tinkundla. The system is built to include the devolution of state power from central government to Tinkundla. And Tinkundla, in simple terms, is essentially constituencies, different constituencies in the country where individual merit is the basis for election and appointment into public office. These constituencies are meant to provide the link between communities and government. There is a Ministry of Tinkundla Administration, which has the mandate to facilitate management of these various constituencies and promote service delivery, while Tinkundla is described as being the foundation for the bottom-up development planning process and the delivery of local services. This is unfortunately not the case. Political parties and political activism have been banned in Eswatini since 1973. You've heard about the history of that situation from King Sobuza's time. Since that time, the kingdom has employed repressive laws, including sedition and terrorism charges, to silence critics. This has seen the arrest and detention of journalists, political activists, human rights defenders, and others who have spoken out against the repression. Instead, the king relies on a sibaya, which is a traditional consultation, which is seen by the Swazi authorities as a people's parliament. But in reality, it has become a convening where the king makes announcements and decrees, and these are communicated to the people. On the 24th of June, the former acting Prime Minister, Themba Masuku, announced that government had suspended the delivery of petitions to Tinkundla centres. This method of delivery of petitions to the Tinkundla centres is the only means of individuals and Swazis and people in the country engaging with the government. So effectively, the government had cut off this engagement with immediate effect, saying that the petition delivery exercise had created a breeding ground for anarchy and has been intentionally hijacked to sow the seeds of division. And of course, this followed the processes which we saw, the protests, the anti-monarchy, pro-democracy protests, which we've seen since the killing of Thabani Nkomoyo. That decision was very quickly reversed, and the acting Prime Minister circulated an email address to receive petitions. Of course, that email address didn't work, and the long and the short of it is that petitions are again being received by the Tinkundlas, but the whole way in which that whole process evolved has caused a huge amount of dissatisfaction and unhappiness, which eventually has led to a number of individual protests and joint protests, but culminating in what happened last week, Friday, which was a Change and Justice March, organized sometime in advance, but the king, knowing that this march had been organized, also arranged a sibaya to be held on that Friday as well. I'll stop there for the moment, Nikiwe.
Yes, thanks, Kaajal, for making reference to that, because we know that, again, in an unprecedented move, people actually did not show up to the sibaya. So the king calls them. I guess he was trying to test his popularity. I don't know, but people actually defied requests to attend this meeting, even though we also understand that at the Solidarity March, which was a march that was held also to commemorate the more than 70 or 80 people that have died at the hands of the army and the police, which has been going around, even having door-to-door campaigns, if that's what you would call it, going door-to-door in homes and villages, attacking people, brutalizing people, killing people, a sort of a witch hunt against anybody who has spoken against the king and the political system, whether it's activists, students, journalists, political party representatives. So could I just ask you, Red Deprose, if you can just speak to us about the actual everyday lived reality of civilians in Eswatini. We've received videos, they're doing the rounds, we see them on the news, audios as well, of the type of brutality that is taking place. So can you just paint a picture for us about what life is like for Swazi people on a day-to-day basis?
Thank you very much, Nikiwe, for that question. And just before touching on everyday life, at least relative to what has happened, one of the contextual issues we need to take into consideration is when the Prime Minister, as Kaajal has indicated that he did not want people to go and deposit petitions at Tikuntla councils. He wanted them to use an email system, right? You would imagine that he's talking about the US or some other Western country. In Swaziland, less than 47% internet penetration rate in the country. So to say that only those with access to internet will be able to deploy their petitions is to limit the wider participation of over half of the country who are unable to access internet through the available means. That's just one of the ways in which the methods that are being tested and promoted for popular participation are the ones that limit participation. But on a day-to-day basis, we are dealing, as I indicated to you, with a regime that deploys lawfare, weaponizes the law as an instrument of governance. At this time, today, 2 more people were killed, adding that number to over 90 now people who have been confirmed dead. 150 people have been hospitalized. Over 90 people, if not now more than 100, closely monitored by a number of our colleagues on the ground, incarcerated, and dozens are still unaccounted for because of the havoc that was caused last week. Now, the everyday reality of civil society leaders is that you are a target of political persecution. You are a target of arrest. You are a target of demonization. You are a target of scapegoating. The language deployed since the protest began is to try and link those who are protesting to outside forces. So once you link people to outside forces, you are raising the stakes of participation in a political sense to participation equals overthrow of the government. Or you are not able to think for yourselves. You can only think if an external agent has been actively associating with you. So you have this politics of demonization and scapegoating is part and parcel of the system of governance in which rhetoric like that is deployed from time to time. Swaziland is also a country that is seeking to grow its economy by exploiting the sugar industry. However, the sugar industry itself is caught up in forced evictions of ordinary people who are in places such as Nokwani, the Malkans, and Vuvulwane, where Amnesty International carried out research in 2019 to examine root causes of why people are routinely evicted from the places that they have lived for, sometimes for 70 years. And there is a relationship that emerges between private capital and the state. But if you examine that private capital, you see that it's private capital that is in the hands of the royal family. And so they will use their state to instrumentalize it and ensure that people who are located in places where accumulation for income from private exploitation of sugar and sugarcane can benefit the royal family. So an uneasy parasitic relationship between private capital and the royal family because they are one. So if you are not from the royal family, it means you are excluded on a day-to-day basis from participating in economic activity that is most likely to be of benefit to you. So you have that economic exclusion. You have the triple burden of unemployment, poverty, and inequality affecting young people who are coming out of school and universities unable to get jobs. This is why this particular protest mobilized people not just from Matsapa and Manzini and Mabane in urban areas. It mobilized people from outside of urban areas as well, because the income gap between rural communities and urban communities is becoming too wide. The levels of desperation in rural areas are such that anyone who is living there is asking questions about where are the resources going. So in economic terms, you are dealing with a population that is living under this triple burden of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Swaziland has the dubious honor of being a middle-income country, but there is nothing to celebrate about that status because the inequality levels are so high that there is nothing middle income about the population that lives there. So with that kind of economic reality or picture that I'm painting, questions get asked about survival, about employment, and therefore popular participation becomes the answer. How can we go and petition Parliament to resolve our problems? When you do so, you are blocked. In the last 3 weeks, we saw even people who are not Swazi not left out of this chaos. 2 journalists from Time Frame magazine who had gone into Swaziland on assignment were arrested, were told that they must delete the footage that they had assembled on their cameras, Magnificent Mdebele and Trebeli Sembuyisa. They were told that they must delete, and they were tortured, harassed, and then, released later on after being told, in no uncertain terms that they were not welcome. We have the Pudemo, which is the political party that is proscribed. Their activists are constantly harassed, they are constantly targeted, they are constantly persecuted. You have Tukoswa, which is the union, or rather the motherboard of trade union organizations. Their leadership constantly harassed. You have the Ngwane National Liberatory Congress, whose president, Lindwe Masbuko, was also part of the people who were arrested. Sibongile Masbuko, who was part of the people who were arrested. And so are student, youth, and other people connected with the pro-democracy movement. So if you look at the pattern of arrest, they go for people that are seen as civil society leaders, as human rights defenders, as community organizers, as anyone who is challenging the status quo. That's the picture that you have for civil society groups. And one of the bigger issues for this audience is, what do you do with civil society organizations that are disparate, that are not properly organized and under-resourced at a time when they need to be seen to be acting to represent the interests of Swazi people? Thank you.
You certainly touch on some very important issues there, Deprose. I mean, just this weekend alone, we were also getting reports of a lady who's part of the Swaziland Rural Women's Assembly who was picked up, arrested, and basically intimidated, over the weekend because of her activism. So we're seeing that increasingly across the board as well, regardless of which sector your civil society activism is taking place. So to come to you, Kaajal, Deprose has spoken about the extent of capture, state capture, economic capture, if you'd like, with the monarchy being in cahoots with the private sector and how pervasive the tenterhooks of the monarchy is, in terms of consuming almost each and every economic opportunity and excluding people. Can we talk about what happened with MTN? MTN is one of the telecoms companies. It's a private sector company. I know that Swazi government does have shares in it, but Swazi MTN was instructed to shut down communications. And that is one of the problems that we're still sitting with today, because until as recently as last week, I think, we were still only getting about 1 hour of internet access. And it was only during that open window of an hour that colleagues, members of society in Swaziland could, access their phones, access the internet, share information. So I know that there's also been some legal cases that have been taken up. MTN itself, in an unprecedented move again, took the government to court because, they felt that their operations were being hampered. So could you tell us a little bit more, Kaajal, about some of the legal cases that are happening and what has the role of the courts been so far in the struggle for democracy?
Sure, Nikiwe. To start off with, the legal challenge which SALC filed against MTN, the internet service provider, was filed several weeks ago, a day after MTN had shut down the internet. They did appear in court on one occasion, and during that court hearing, MTN's lawyers, in their arguments to the court, said that they were instructed by the Swazi government to shut down the internet. They failed to share the directive with the court or with SALC. And what they said to the court was that they intended only to shut down social media, but they didn't know how to do this. And in error, they completely shut down all internet services. So we know this was completely disingenuous and a complete fabrication. MTN has operations in several other African countries where it's done exactly the same thing. It has shut down the internet in Nigeria, in Uganda, we fear that with the Zambian elections coming up, there might be something similar in Zambia as well. So the SALC challenge was extremely important to stand up to MTN, and both SALC and ICJ have been corresponding with MTN since the shutdown, and they have surprisingly agreed to meet with us, and we have a meeting set up with them for next week. I'm very surprised that they agreed to meet. I'm just unsure how forthcoming they will agree to be in the meeting with us, but certainly we're going to proceed with this meeting and we'll see where things go. The one thing with MTN is that we've discovered that they have extremely progressive human rights policies, internal policies and guidelines which guide their work, and for them to have these policies appears to be just a show, because they certainly don't seem to be living up to any of these policies. They are sham. And this is precisely why we want to have the discussion with them. We've also specifically requested the directive from the Swazi authorities, because we want to see the basis on which they agreed to shut down the internet. So that meeting is coming up. And then to deal with all of the other legal challenges which have been going on in Eswatini over the years, I'll give you just a snapshot of some things which have happened. So 2 pieces of legislation specifically target critical voices and human rights defenders in Eswatini, and this is the Suppression of Terrorism Act, the 2008 piece of legislation, and the Sedition and Subversive Activities Act, which is quite old, from 1938. And there's a few other bits, but those are the 2 most important bits which are used to harass and persecute. A number of activists have attempted to challenge the constitutionality of those sedition and terrorism laws. Constitutional challenges were launched by Thulani Maseko, who was charged with sedition after making a statement during a May Day rally in 2009 commemorating deceased activists. 3 activists were charged with sedition for taking part in a demonstration and being in possession of a banner. Mario Masuku and Maxwell Dlamini were charged with sedition and terrorism after speaking at a May Day rally in 2014. They spent nearly a year and a half in jail before being released on bail. And then in April 2014, Mlungisi Makanya, along with 6 others, was charged under the Suppression of Terrorism Act for wearing a T-shirt which had the Podemo logo on it. The list goes on and on and on. So people speaking at rallies, wearing T-shirts, carrying posters which have logos of political parties. These are all deemed seditious and terrorist acts. These people are deemed to be terrorists and harassed and persecuted and prosecuted by the state. The Eswatini High Court in 2016 held, as part of these legal challenges, that despite Podemo being a specified entity under the Suppression of Terrorism Act, arresting persons purely for belonging to this group and for wearing its T-shirts and chanting its slogans interfered with their rights to freedom of association and freedom of expression. The High Court declared the offences of sedition and subversion unconstitutional, rendering the act inoperable. In its reasoning, the High Court found that the state failed to show that the restrictions on the applicant's freedom of expression were reasonable or justifiable. This was at the High Court level. The state noted an appeal to that judgment, subsequently missed the filing deadline for that appeal by many months. Then it attempted to file an application to condone missing the filing deadline, which the court was not going to hear. And essentially, that appeal has now lapsed because the state has failed to appeal it within the time that was allowed for the appeal. So essentially, that High Court judgment should stand, notwithstanding the fact that that High Court judgment should stand. Other people continue to be charged under the same acts, continue to be persecuted, and there appears to be no finality about what will happen with these laws. The courts have not come out to rescue individuals who are charged under these laws, and this is a very serious problem in Eswatini. There were amendments to the Suppression of Terrorism Act in 2017, but it failed to address the concerns which the court raised in its judgment. So essentially, the Suppression of Terrorism Act is so loosely worded that inhibits the right to freedom of expression, association, and assembly. So where a legitimate protest or demonstration is organized by a designated terrorist group, a person who attends such an event could potentially be guilty of the offence of giving support to that terrorist group, even though no terrorist act is planned for or at the event, and they risk a 15-year term of imprisonment. Podemo, which is the main and largest political party in the country, has been designated as a terrorist group in 2008. So Podemo continues to be a target of the state, and individuals who are members of and supporters of Podemo also continue to be targeted by the state.
Thanks for that, Kaajal. So here we are, colleagues, we're dealing with, a context where the courts are weak. Definitely there are questions around the degree of independence that the judiciary enjoys. The police and army really are just an extension of the monarchy, and they do not seem to be able to protect and uphold human rights. So there are questions there around who are our allies. That's the first question. The other issue that has really come up also is, how do we provide support to civil society when it's so fragmented and it's weak and it operates in a hostile environment? And the third thing that I've noted also is the huge question around the role of the private sector in closing down the civic space, and also questions around business and human rights and upholding those principles. I think we can just go through two more key questions. So the first question to both our speakers really is, we have seen an outpouring of solidarity from so many quarters. The ANC government in South Africa has spoken out. The EU, SADC also, although quite slow to act, recently sent a mission, but they were criticized not just for their slow pace, but also the fact that they did not go the extra mile to meet with a broad range of stakeholders. So we know that SADC only met with selected few members that were selected by the monarchy and the state. We know that SADC went back late last week, and we're hoping that this time around they're going to engage with broader civil society, including the opposition as well and other political players. So can you both speak to us briefly about the ongoing political interventions? What should we expect? Do we think that the 5 demands are going to be met? Do we think that SADC has the power to at least initiate dialogue? Because it seems like the king is digging his heels in. If you listen to the speech that he gave this past Friday at Sibaya, where he threw a lot of insults and was quite tone deaf, in the sense that instead of meeting with citizens and the civil society network and hearing the issues that were raised, he decided instead to appoint a new permanent prime minister, which was totally at odds with the 5 demands that were being made. So can you please quickly just speak to us about the current political interventions? What hope do we have, and what should we be expecting?
So you're right. I think the king is very isolated from appreciating the salt of the earth, from appreciating what actually goes on a day-to-day basis. This is a highly consumptive royal family, and really has tied its destiny to the model of governance that they have. So any kind of reform or a change is not something that they contemplate. And it's not just the King Mswati who is the figurehead of this royal enterprise. It is a network of parasitic connections between the family, the business structure, and interests that run far beyond what we see every day. I had the occasion to meet with the late Prime Minister, who was replaced by the acting one who caused this violence, in 2019, when we were presenting a report on forced evictions that we had just done. The meeting was supposed to be with the Prime Minister to present recommendations. One of the things we were calling for was a moratorium on forced evictions until the legal framework was sorted. And we had researched the sugarcane growing areas as sites of eviction. When I got into the meeting in the Prime Minister's office, there was an assortment of men in suit who were from the Sugar Association of Swaziland. They so dominated that meeting, demonstrating the complete capture with which the Prime Minister was presenting himself. Him and the Attorney General, whom we had prepared to meet, said the least in that meeting, and the Sugar colleagues were the ones who spoke the most, demonstrating how embedded business is with the state and how captured the state is. So the cosmetic reform of changing a prime minister is what the king thinks is change. And when in fact the fundamental demand for people is for the prime minister to be elected, not chosen by the king. So the king is doing exactly what him and his group in the royal family would want to do. And the tone deafness is not something new. We have seen that especially for people whose time of falling has come. They become even more repressive instead of taking advantage of the opening to start pushing for reforms. So you have that as a picture. But I think for the first time, eSwatini is under sustained scrutiny and under sustained criticism and sustained attention. There has been the mobilization of the Swazi diaspora in Canada, in the US, in the UK, in South Africa here. There's been a progressive regathering of the progressive left, which organized itself to comment on what has been happening. So the amount of solidarity and the clarity with which people outside of Swaziland are speaking at the moment reflects a movement in the advocacy around the Swaziland question globally. And I think the regime is hearing that, is feeling that, and can see signs that people are not about to retreat from putting Swaziland under the spotlight. This meeting we are having here, I've been working on Swaziland for over a decade. I've not had a meeting like this in the work that we have done on Swaziland. So it reflects change. The Universal Periodic Review, the submission we made in April, reflect a growing interest in picking up these reports and using them for sustained advocacy. So that's the context in which we should see the SADC engagement. SADC engagement itself has generally been a very disappointing enterprise because the so-called organ on politics, defense, and security, which is supposed to intervene between summits and ensure that it restores or guarantees or promotes peace and security, tends to be interested more in regime security rather than human security. So when it gets into countries like Zimbabwe, it tends to associate itself, the delegation associates themselves with the ruling class of that country. It's not only SADC that does that, even the ANC government the ANC party, ruling party in South Africa, recently traveled to Zimbabwe last year when there was a sustained Zimbabwean Lives Matter campaign to check what was going on. And they could only meet with their ruling party counterparts. This danger of a very narrow construction of what SADC is about, which is heads of state and government and not the people, creates this environment where SADC goes into Swaziland on the 4th and only meets with one side. It took some brave and courageous civil society colleagues who went and stormed into the meeting and demanded to also make an input. This is why we have now had a second technical committee or facilitation team that has gone in now with the promise of seeing everyone. We hope that they actually see everyone. What was useful about the first SADC Troika intervention was that it was actually consisting of very senior people. Naledi Pandor, the Minister for Foreign Affairs in South Africa, Frederick Shawa, long-time diplomat, Minister of Foreign Affairs in Zimbabwe, and Lebogang Kwape, Minister of Foreign Affairs in Botswana. Very senior people that went in there. But sometimes their seniority becomes the only positive issue. The ability to sink into propaganda of the state and to view Swaziland through the lens of their own domestic policy tends to limit the prospects of change through SADC-mediated outcomes, which is why it is important to augment what's happening with SADC with wider support to civil society, with rethinking how we are supporting media and thinking more broadly about how the consensus that is emerging globally around the diaspora communities and other communities that care about Swaziland are coming together, and we're finding expression through different voices and mechanisms, not only to talk about the demands, but to deal with the urgent question of the injuries, the relief that is needed, the legal cases that are now being mounted, the dragnet arrests that are going on. So I think we shouldn't see the Troika intervention in an isolated sense. It should be located in the context of resolving the immediate problems, the medium-term problems, and the long-term problems of the country.
Thanks, Deprose. And I think Deprose has covered that very well. SADC has had a dismal record and is very well remembered for its disappointing interventions. within Southern Africa. For eSwatini, it has made a poor effort to consult broadly. SADC is currently in eSwatini. I was informed by some local activists who I spoke with this afternoon, and they confirmed that SADC is meeting with political parties and with the structure, the multi-stakeholder forum that has enunciated those 5 demands. What exactly it will do with those requests and those demands, and whether it will try to facilitate a dialogue with the Swazi administration and with the king, is uncertain. However, looking back at SADC's record, this seems unlikely. From what we've seen with the king and the Swazi administration, the king will be unwilling and closed off to any kind of dialogue, and will not go into any kind of dialogue and discussion willingly and openly without very serious pressure brought to bear on the kingdom, and this includes financial pressures. The situation of COVID in the kingdom doesn't help the situation either. People are concerned about super spreader events. The state is using the COVID restrictions which are in place to try and limit gatherings, to try and suppress protests. And this is causing a great deal of difficulty, which is another factor to consider. I think Deprose has covered that very well, so I don't need to speak further about that.
Thank you both for your responses. I think, Niamani, can we pause here and see if we have any questions from our audience?
Yes, thank you. So the first question, many are saying that things have died down in Swaziland and the pro-democracy movement has lost momentum. Do you agree with this sentiment? And what impact do you think the past few weeks will have on the likelihood of Swaziland to transition to a more democratic state? Kaajal, why don't I ask you to respond to that first?
Thanks, Niamani. And I have to say, I don't know how there is that perception that things are dying down in Swaziland. From the individuals and from the organizations that I've been speaking to, that I've been in contact with, that is the opposite of what is happening in Swaziland. So people have dug their heels. They seem to now be in this for the long haul and seem to want to push for change regardless of what happens. So I really do think that the impact of the last few weeks is going to continue for weeks, for months to come, until we can see some kind of movement and push towards some dialogue towards transition to a more democratic state, and even possibly leading to some form of election process.
Nikiwe, because you're a funder, I would like to get your impression of that.
Yeah, I agree with Kaajal. There's a misconception really that, that things have died down. And because there's this limit, and a breakdown in communication, with the restrictions on communications, we're not getting as much information or as fast, as it should come out. So it creates that impression. But what that has not done is that there's a lot of impunity happening. And unless you're working with people on the ground in the know-how, you will not realize how bad it is. There are young children we were burying this weekend because, the police were shooting indiscriminately. There are people who died who were attending a funeral this weekend, and they were viewed as speaking out of turn because they criticized the king. And there was a police officer who allegedly went to the police station, fetched some arms, and came and shot them dead. That is the level of impunity that we're dealing with. We're talking about, the army going door to door, beating girls, beating women up for no reason, taking defenseless people, regardless of their age, whether they're young, whether they're old, and locking them up. There are hundreds of people who are being denied access to lawyers, and word has it that they've been instructed to keep people in police holding cells and deny them access to any legal assistance. And that is the problem with the private sector being complicit to what is happening. When they agree willingly to shut down the internet, for instance, these are the impacts that we're talking about. So no, things have not died down. In fact, people are more daring and they're willing to sacrifice, to pay the ultimate cost really, which is to sacrifice their lives, because it's almost like it's a point of no return. The slogan that people are using online right now on social media is, "The time is now. It is time." So no, if anything, there's a stronger drive for democracy. And we are supporting that. We are supporting different sectors of civil society because it's people's democratic right to participate fully, not just politically, but also socially and economically in their countries.
Thank you, Nikiwe. Deprose, I'm going to ask you to to comment on the first question about the movement losing momentum, but I'd also like for you to speak to the question of what impact do you think the past few weeks will have on the likelihood of Swaziland to transition to a more democratic state?
I really think that the pro-democracy movement, the human rights movement, civil society is energized at the present moment. And it is much more solid and much more cooperating together than at any time in the past. It is, of course, coming across a very vicious state, a state that is willing to kill in order to justify its existence. I mean, long after the cameras are gone, you're going to be having people with disabilities arising from gunshot wounds. We still have people who have bullets in their bodies and need to be moved to South Africa for some of the bullets to be removed. I recall we worked on a case of the shooting in Marikana where a person had a bullet for 8 months. There are people who now need wheelchairs. There's been a big problem of forensic evidence management, limited pathology experts in the country, only 2 state forensic pathologists in Mbambane and Manzini. Several HRDs injured and arrested. This has been fuel to a long-standing grievance against the state. And if the state thought it was going to demobilize people through use of violence, including 2 people who were shot dead today by an off-duty police officer, each of these reports, as they come into society, into the region, they galvanize the movement for human rights. They galvanize the movement for political reform. They galvanize the movement against what is going on. So I think the government tries to put this narrative that we have returned everything to order, but there's no order. Businesses that collapsed, a threatening humanitarian crisis. The WFP says almost 60% of the rural population in Swaziland live below $2 a day. These are the issues that are being talked about now more than ever before. So I think there is a sustained momentum within the domestic arena, but also regionally and internationally. The medium to long-term prognosis for me is that the prospects for continuing to run an entire state on the basis of the model we have seen in Eswatini so far is not sustainable. Something will have to give in. And I think that the last 3 weeks have clarified to the region and to the international community what is wrong with this kingdom and why it should actually change. The 5 demands that have been put forward are demands that are very possible for people to rally around. So I see a lot more people rallying around that. But we have made a separate demand as Amnesty. We have said that there should be a thorough, independent and transparent investigation into what has happened, because we really believe that the people who issued orders of shoot to kill should be held accountable for the loss of lives that we have seen, especially through live ammunition. And we saw that call was also made by the UN, that there should be a thorough, independent investigation into what happened. And I think as more of these voices grow, they are not going to drop those calls. We certainly are not going to drop that call. We're going to raise it every other time. So the convergence between what's starting to happen in the international sphere and what's happening domestically is going to squeeze the regime. And unlike Angola, Zimbabwe, Zambia, where those regimes have capacity to withstand pressure globally and domestically, I don't see the Swazi authorities sustaining the capacity to resist the kind of onslaught that they have faced here. So long term is that we are in this for a while, and this is why I think, in my view, for this meeting, it's important that we think about what do we do then in this environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Deprose. The significant factor in the opposition is the 3 MPs agitating for change. So what impact could this possibly have on keeping the momentum going? The civil society coalition that has formed and put forth the 5 demands. Since it's been difficult for progressive forces to come together in the past, I wonder how inclusive is the makeup of this coalition? Kaajal, can I ask you to respond to that?
Yes, sure, Niamani. The civil society coalition which has formed, first of all, Swaziland is a small community. The community of people who are members of political parties and civil society activists, it really is a small community. So this civil society coalition has formed organically, but has formed out of people who have traditionally been working in the sector for decades. So it's these progressive forces have always been in existence, but I think the increased momentum now exists for them to want to work together towards the similar aims and demands has caused them to work in one voice with the same outcome. So I think it is possible to liaise with this group. There are representatives of the group who are available to speak with all of you. I hear from Niamani that there will be a consultation with Swazi activists and civil society and possibly political party members coming up as well. So you will have some opportunity to dialogue and interact directly with them. So because the civil society space is so small, I think that it would be fairly easy to provide this kind of support to groups and coalitions and so forth in Eswatini, particularly as they are all agreed on what demands that they want going forward. There are already discussions with several groups and individuals and with lawyers on the need to provide legal assistance and legal advice almost immediately, as well as support for strategic litigation interventions, advocacy support, and in particular support for independent, credible media reporting on the country. There's always, as we live in this fake news era, that it's very difficult to know what is credible, what is not credible, and what news can be relied on. And that is one thing which is sorely needed. And support for independent, credible media is one area in which support would be greatly valued. And of course, there's also a need for ongoing humanitarian assistance, food, medical care, assistance with burials, and so forth. And there continues to be need to support an independent investigation. So very briefly, that's what I would suggest as things which are in need of support and how to direct this support towards those outcomes.
Thank you, Kaajal. So, Deprose, I'm going to ask you to speak to the question about the civil society coalition having formed and how inclusive it is, and about the 3 MPs in terms of their call for change. And I'm also going to layer on top of that the question about how do you provide support without picking winners?
Thank you very much. The issue of the MPs, I think, was an important one. We have not seen in a long time members of parliament in the Tikuntla system working progressively with civil society. But there were 2 MPs in particular, Simelane and Mabuza, Honorable Simelane and Mabuza from Spofanene and Osia. They played a key role in raising issues in parliament, but also connecting with civil society, using their platform as a platform for change, and explained, after exploring all options they thought they could have to change things from within and failing, explaining to wider civil society the impossibility of getting change through parliament. That alliance has been very useful. I attended one meeting of the diaspora in Canada, the Canadian diaspora, and they invited these MPs to speak directly to the diaspora. And you can just see an emerging partnership there between people who never used to work together in the past. So that's an important dimension that we can also look at, that to make change happen, sometimes strange bedfellows begin to coalesce and share information and strategy for them to maximize opportunity for change. Second important question you ask about how inclusive is this coalition that's forming. Firstly, I think we look at inclusion in terms of groups and sectors that are represented. And keep in mind, Kaajal has already indicated that we are dealing with a smaller number of groups in a smaller country. But I think I want to look at inclusion as the kinds of issues that are being placed for discussion. Now, they've put 5 issues for discussion. One of the things that the diaspora meeting did was to start talking about the representation of women in the political process and in the democratization process. And people like Dua Pane, who was there to speak to the question of how gendered are our current calls for transition and reform, how inclusive are we in terms of our political discourse, but also in terms of the leadership that's emerging to call for reform and changes. That was the first time I had a proper challenge about the question of diversity and inclusion, because if that debate is not conducted now, the transition can risk becoming one that's not engendered. And when it's not engendered, it is endangered. So people like Dua Pane's voice, people like Tulima Kama and so on, these are people that I think will have to play a bigger role in ensuring that we have an inclusive movement, an inclusive group of people that are raising also inclusive issues. Those would be my 2 responses to the question of role of MPs, but also the question of inclusion.
Thank you, Deprose. Since Kaajal has also given us some recommendations about how funders can support civil society and what's going on, can I ask you to also give us your perspective on how funders can support what's happening in Swaziland?
So I think, first of all, we must take a long-term approach. So the longer-term approach, in my view, is thinking about building a resilient human rights movement in a politically constrained context. And because we know that civil society and key individuals play a key role in defending human rights during times of crisis. And we just have seen that we are relying on a very small battery of people, Tulani Maseko, and end up just moving around the same people. And therefore, working alongside groups such as the Foundation for Socio-Economic Justice, the Council of Churches, the Swazi Rural Women's Assembly, and others is so important in providing an efficient and impactful and a relevant response centered around the people of Eswatini, in particular, their rights. So thinking about long-term resilience and with it, capacity building of civil society groups has been an expressed need in the last 3 weeks, both in terms of technical assistance, working through advocacy, law-based campaigning, but also tactical responses to working in an autocracy in which the regime is not afraid to unleash gunfire. What sort of tactical thinking and planning do you deploy? So that capacity building for specialized interventions, but tactical response, very important. Smaller grant-making programs which can safeguard very vital civil society groups to be present at all times and play a role in a moment like this. I agree with Kaajal in terms of support to media and advocacy, because what we have seen is very small voices of media inside Eswatini. I think you can also support regional media that have dedicated work on Eswatini. Groups like the Media Institute for Southern Africa can come to mind. Then there's immediate issues. The immediate issues I think we can look at is medical support services for survivors. We can look at forensic pathology, because it's so important to collect evidence that tells us why did people die. And the government is happy to cover that and just bury people very quickly. Families have to check and collect all the evidence we need for the future. Relocation of some of the HRDs that are really at risk, either within the country or within the region. Psychological support. We're dealing with long-term trauma. We're dealing with people who have received threats to their lives, people who have been moved, people who have lost livelihoods, people who have lost jobs. So thinking about a psychological support program to intervene is important. Then legal support and litigation, both to defend those who are being unlawfully arrested and charged or forced to sign declaration of admission of guilt forms, so that you now start to live with a criminal record. And long-term litigation in an area that can impact on the constitution. Then the final one is economic livelihoods and relief. There are many people that we have spoken to who have lost livelihoods. In the short term, we might need to be thinking about what to do with them. In the long term, it is really about thinking about, if this were to happen again, what safeguards do you put in place to prevent humanitarian crisis? Those would be some of the things I would see as in need of attention at the moment.
Deprose, thank you. Nikiwe, can you talk about the ways that funders can provide support if they don't fund in Swaziland?
Yes, thanks, Niamani. Just before I go to that, I wanted to say that we also strongly feel we need to support those independent investigations. And the issue of transitional justice is really, really important, especially as we hopefully move towards a democratic dispensation, because we need to hold the state to account for all these human rights violations. And we need to do so in a way that provides citizens a space to heal, to recover, and to rebuild meaningfully. So if you're not supporting currently any initiatives in Swaziland, what can you do? I would suggest that you get in touch with any of our organizations, and we could definitely assist in setting up a pooled fund where we could draw from. So this would be unrestricted funding that would go where the need is most. So it is just to say, reach out to ICJ, reach out to Amnesty, and find out how you can join those efforts. Thanks, Niamani.
I want to thank Kaajal and Deprose and Nikiwe for participating with us this morning, for giving us some great insights into what's going on, for taking the time out of your schedule to be with us. So thank you all very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conversations With. We hope you enjoyed it. Please visit our website at africagrantmakers.org and join our mailing list. Until our next Conversations With, be well.